Three,
Yeah.
two. And we're here with Pola Bunster, a very special guest, VP of Storytelling and Editing, and one of my favorite people from my whole life, and a resident expert of Miami, and probably my favorite person to watch the Academy Awards with, even virtually. Um, Pola Bunster, please tell me what a VP of storytelling is, especially a Miami version of one.
Wow, wow, that is an intro of all intros. Well, so it's pretty much a sexier version of like digital strategist, but basically, it started with the fact that there really isn't just a single place or single platform or a single voice that unifies Miami's history and like things to do and culture and if you're born and raised in Miami or you've been living here for a while, you're kind of at the mercy of, however many platforms there are for people to access that information. And the fact of the matter is that those platforms tend to be pay to play or be curated by people whose tastes might differ from a lot of like culture vultures like ourselves. So, we kind of took it upon ourselves to make sure that that story is being told, but also being told in a way that is historically accurate, includes a lot of background history of the city, and also is as inclusive as possible. So, there are people who are being paid millions of dollars a year to tell Miami's story, and it is not only not true, it's based in a stereotype that is totally unfair and does a huge detriment to the city. In its identity. So, we're kind of warriors on the ground telling that story and kind of correcting people in a way that isn't condescending.
Okay, so
So
let's
yeah.
not name names or anything, but I do want to know who you're thinking of that when you say that so viscerally.
Right.
Um, because, Miami Vice or things like that come to mind. That was like in the 80s and 90s, but that definitely did a disservice to Miami. Like people, I remember, being in high school and having people like tell me like, "Oh, isn't it just a place where drug lords live? Like, isn't
Right.
everyone
I
sell
mean,
drugs
and
there?"
it's not true, like it's not like we're all like sweeping a part of our history under the rug for sure. But, even in the 80s, there really isn't anyone stopping and thinking and saying, okay, like that is a part of what was happening in Miami for sure, in the same way that a very similar persona was happening on the streets of New York. But when people show New York in the 80s, they're also showing movies about romance and like all kinds of stories. But for some reason, the movies that always take place in Miami always have to do with drugs and drug cartels or, sports players who make millions of dollars or like, babes in bikinis and bitches on the beach, as I like to call it, like the alliterative bees. And it's like, someone has to stop and be like, BS. I'm calling BS on this because there definitely was a normal family living in Miami in the 80s that was living a very wholesome, happy life, that involved probably a lot of water and pets and being outside and going to Fairchild Tropical Garden, and
I
that
think I know a
nowhere
family like
intersect.
that. I know a family just like that. I would make a movie about them. Uh,
Right, and no one's saying it's not interesting, like, yeah, for sure, it's not glamorous, and Michelle Pfeiffer isn't wearing an amazing silk dress, but it's definitely more realistic, and, Miami's history is yeah, okay, it's, like, almost a little over 100 years old, for sure, if you're counting, but it's still, rich in its own ways, and it has everything from like indigenous culture to waves and waves of immigrants that aren't just the Cuban or Latin American communities, and there are just so many stories that are not being told or aren't being told in full that are doing an injustice to the way Miami is portrayed to the rest of the world.
I think we've gotten to the heart of one of the matters, which is that to me, I've always associated you with movies. And when we talk so much about movies, I mean, there's a reason why. Like your heart is also in the movies, in a
Oh yeah.
way, right? Am I right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm definitely, I mean, you're definitely on the same wave as this. Like, I love art history and music and food and all these other things, but there's something about movies and now even like long form television that just always calls me back. It's the most, I think it's the most visceral form of storytelling outside of the written word, because the fact that you could be looking at a page with some ink on it and be like, a million miles away or in a different period or in a different universe is pretty fantastic. But movies, really just brings that to life in a way that probably relates to a lot more people's attention spans and areas of interest. And it's also a really unforgiving medium, which is so great because it's really easy for people like me who are like instant, like I'm gonna critique everything, you know.
Well, yes, it's true.
Movies are a cruel mistress, you know. So
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
get to
yeah.
tell a story right and well and in a way that connects people, in large quantities, I feel like you've done a great job.
I agree, but, I don't know why it seems very salacious of me, but I'm very interested in those who misrepresent Miami also. Can you talk about The Beauty and the Baker or
Mm.
the Big have you seen that?
I have not, and it's
Okay.
funny because what I do like about The Beauty and the Baker, which I haven't seen, but what I can tell from like the Netflix trailer is that it is one of those stories that like could take place in any other city. It doesn't necessarily need to take place in Miami. I think the fact that it takes place in Miami is like a cool quirk. But I find that really interesting because it goes back to what I was saying. Like you can have these storylines that, for all intents and purposes, could take place in San Francisco or in LA or in like other pretty expensive and glamorous cities. And you can put them in Miami and they don't have to do with like being on the boat and like doing cocaine and and it makes sense because those stories do exist here. So there is like a great thing when you do have these pretty stereotypical characters prancing around Miami, like, what was the serial killer one that was like really really big in Miami? Man, I can't remember. It's like on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, and it took place in Miami, and it was just like cool that it was in Miami because it could have easily taken place anywhere else. It didn't, need to be in Miami. But I think deciding for it to take place here and also deciding not to make it a stereotype of being here is pretty cool too.
Right, because it's an Israeli format, right? And so, I mean, ostensibly, they had to just take something that I guess had its own cultural quirks and then redo it for the ones here. I think my issue with it more than, trying to do something Miami-ish and then having, like, kind of a weird mix of, like, not Cuban people playing Cuban people, which I don't know. I guess,
Oh God.
it should be allowed, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure yet. We'll think about it. I'm sure that a lot of people will write scathing, critiques of my work when I do that. But, I think that it's this kind of chauvinist fantasy of being like, he doesn't want the girl who wants a stable life. He wants this fantasy girl who's very rich
Mm.
and only wants adventure and shows up to take him and whisk him away to these magical places. It's like, give me a fucking break.
Yeah, absolutely,
It's like every
absolutely.
male fantasy wrapped into one, and it's like, he's just a baker. She doesn't mind because she's rich. Like, it's like,
Yeah. No, for sure. It also makes you think like, wow, like this is what people are sitting around the table saying yes to, when you know that there are millions of amazing stories out there waiting to be turned into movies or TV shows, and somehow, some way,
well,
some of that content pulls through.
tell me about that. Tell me about the things that inspire you. I want to know more about you.
Oh man, I mean, specifically when it comes to storytelling, right? And in this case, movies or TV, I'm really I mean, obviously, I'm a fantasy nerd. I love sci-fi, all the fun stuff. But the stuff that like does leave, you know, a film of residue on me for days on end are usually the movies or the stories that just feel so real. Like I love Richard Linklater, for example. All of his movies take place in a 24-hour period, except for Boyhood, obviously. But that allows his movies and his stories to be more dialogue and character focused. And so the actors get to like add quirks to their body language and like really make everything genuinely feel like someone you've met before. And I love stories that are just extremely natural, very detail oriented, like so much so that it becomes multi-sensory. Like you can almost smell the scenes. And so the more natural the story, the more I just am blown away by it, because it's not an easy thing to do when you work in film. Like this scene that just feels so natural to watch, has like 60 people on set, eight, cameras, a bunch of lights, it's like could not be less natural, but somehow these things get to pull through. So I think I like those kinds of things. I mean, that's not saying that I'm not equally huge fan of like Wes Anderson, for example, but in terms of the stories that I like to be told, or I like to read, or I like to tell, are the ones that are as natural and as true as possible. And so they end up relating to more people that way when you make them feel more real, you know.
Well, I think that that authenticity is definitely something that you curate, at least in all of the events that you've organized that I've been able to participate in over the years. It definitely feels like this just grew up out of the ground right here, and we picked it up and we put it on this stand, and now you can eat it and buy it. Like
Yeah.
with anything, with the musicians, you pluck them out of the ground. Like, you know, um, I mean, curating is a big part of what you do, right? And then at the same
Yeah.
time, you curate and you evaluate. You're sort of like the Time Out of Miami, kind of,
Mm.
but like way more with more authority, if you will,
Right.
because
I
the
mean,
problem
we like to equate ourselves with being like that friend that you always text when you travel somewhere, and you're like, "Oh, Isabel's going to know. I'm going to be in New York for 24 hours. This is the friend that I trust to tell me like the restaurant I have to check out or the bar I have to go to." So we try to be that source for people. And I think a big part of that, the type of curating that we do is very much based in the motive behind it. There are some people who have impeccable taste, but the motive might be wanting to get that cool factor or wanting to make money, and we're just lucky to say that we're in a position where those aren't, high on our priority list. So our motive is really like just wanting to support the good stuff that we think is really good for the sake of other people experiencing this stuff that we think is really good. It's like when you learned something really cool in history class at school and you couldn't wait to come home and like tell your parents about this thing that they probably already knew because they learned it themselves, but you're just so excited to share people something that you learned. That's what a culture crusader is that friend that like doesn't mind going to the bar alone, but discovers this amazing bar and like can't wait to tell their friends, like, guys, we're going here on Friday because it's so good. And it spreads. That's just natural marketing, right? Which obviously not every business is lucky to have. And places like New York that are super pedestrian friendly tend to have naturally because people are walking everywhere. Miami doesn't have that. Miami, you have to know where you're going before you leave your house because nothing is pedestrian friendly. And so that means marketing is way more important here than a lot of other cities because there isn't that sense of natural discovery. And so, not only being put on the map by marketing, but also where you're getting that information is equally as important. So when we talk about places that we suggest for people to go to or we write about, 99.9% of the time we've been there ourselves and can legit vouch for these places, or friends whose tastes we trust have been there and have told us. So it really does feel like a community of people that just like really love a bunch of stuff and want you to try it because it's good and it's worth the drive or the Uber or whatever. And same thing goes for our events, like the vendors and stuff and the experiences that are at our events are a result of that too. They're people whose relationships we've built for years because we've been doing events in Miami for a long time. And they're people whose quality of product we can vouch for, who are grateful to be doing stuff in the community. And these kinds of experience shouldn't cost anything to people. Like they should be paid for by the government because that increases the quality of life, which is something that Miami is in dire need of. Just experiences that make people happy as opposed to, you know, set people way below the, median income. But yeah, so our events really are just because we kind of roll out of bed and we're like, you know what, Miami doesn't have like a really cool flea market with live music. Like, let's just do it, and we're grateful that we're in that position, but it really just comes from what we feel like the city's missing that we see in other places.
And that was a score also on your behalf. The flea
Yeah,
market
right.
was really awesome music. I mean, it just came up in like my photo carousel the other day. The one that you guys did in October 2015. Was that the first one? Like there were all these pumpkins and like
Oh man, that was actually, I think that might have been the second or third one, actually.
right?
But
That
yeah,
was
that was definitely one of the first ones. I completely forgot you were there with Henry. He was way
I
smaller than
know,
he
it
is
was so
now.
exciting, and it was
Yeah.
cool because, my son was so little and, he was, looking at all the pumpkins. It was cool for families and babies and hipsters and young people and old people, and, it was really for everybody, and I think that that's magic. That's how also I feel about film, if everybody can see it,
Mm.
there's a certain magic, and, if you create an event for everybody, I think it's got something extra special.
That's so true, and particularly the film thing. I mean, really, pretty much anything, right? Like, if you make it in that way, that's magical. Like, we always get mad when people talk about like marketing and demographics because they're like, what's your demo? And we're like, dude, like babies and grandparents, like, and 30 to 50s. I don't, like obviously, of course, there's an average, but when things are fun and good and done from the right place, like it's really hard to pin that down.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, what can you tell me about the one that's coming up or your future plans?
Well, so we're doing another Tropical Flea on next Sunday on May 30th, so Memorial Day weekend. Yeah. And so that's gonna be great. We're doing it at Ace Props, which is like a really awesome Hollywood prop shop. And it's a vintage market with food and beer and fun goodies. And for the most part, we're really just, taking it little by little. We're doing kind of the same sort of community building that we've done here in Miami. We have a client in Pittsburgh that's doing something very similar. So that's pretty cool to say that we can equate a lot of the same strategies in terms of community outreach and events and programming in other areas in the United States. So that's pretty awesome. But for the
Yes,
most part,
can you tell me about the Pittsburgh project? Because I always thought that it was like your golden thing was that because you're a Miami girl, you know this place backwards and forwards, and because you're, theater and
yeah,
literature major, events just come out of your pores, you just
yeah,
think them up like that. But that you can apply it to a place that you didn't grow up in. So
right.
your local knowledge is more recently learned. Tell me about how that worked and how that happened.
Well, it's definitely not as easy for sure. It definitely takes a lot more research and development. But for the most part, when we started in Miami, our first big community client was the Arts and Entertainment District. So we helped them, name the neighborhood and bring businesses and basically bring locals to this area of Miami they otherwise had never been to. They just passed over on the highway or something like that. And how did we do it? Through events and experiences and all the things we're talking about here. The storytelling on social media was very Miami focused. And so people started equating the platform with like such a great informational place where I can read up about Miami, but also about this like up and coming neighborhood. And a lot of that involved a lot of community outreach. So, sitting down and looking at all the awesome cultural partners and institutions in Miami, the Arch Center, Miami Film Fest, and finding ways that we could work together outside of just events. And so you can take that same strategy and pinpoint it pretty much anywhere else in the country or in the world. It's really based around, events that are free and open to the public that involve things that everyone likes, like movies and music and food and just great vibes for all ages. And then sitting down with big cultural partners and figuring out bigger picture initiatives, like free rent for a year for a local small business, and like these things that are actually supporting infrastructure and real needs, but also give the neighborhood a nice badge of honor for doing something good, as opposed to being seen as a potential gentrifier, which is a real issue. And then just making sure that people are being heard and involving the community every step of the way in the neighborhood, so that it doesn't seem like the fact is we're people from Miami coming into an area we don't live in, and we're trying to do fun events with good motives, but we want people to see that the motives are actually good, and so we take as much feedback as possible, and that really does shape what we do. It's not hard. We're not reinventing the wheel, but you'd be actually really surprised to see how many agencies get hired, with huge budgets and just come in and do like boozy brunches and don't even pay attention to what people actually want in these cities and also what they actually need.
That is so cool. Pola for president, or at least mayor of Miami, right? The handle is Culture Crusaders, Prism Creative Group, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Pola
Yep.
Bunster.
Culture Crusaders is our editorial platform, and Prism Creative Group is, the agency. So pretty much everything that we do is aggregated there. But Culture Crusaders is where we tell that Miami story.
That is so cool, and I'm so grateful that you do. So Sunday, May 20th at Ace Props, we'll be there to eat some
Yeah.
Japanese treats and see you again. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming on my Spanglish. Before we go, what's your favorite word in Spanish? It can be a bad word or a good word.
I would say what I like to say in Miamian is dale.
Vale, of course. Thank you so much. Mwah, 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 mwah.
Thank you.
And we're out.